Hi, and welcome to today's AMA with Jon Hanman, the co-founder here at DataFuel, which for those of you who don't know is part of the Demand Drive group. Jon, if you're not familiar, has well over a decade of experience working in various leadership roles across the demand generation industry. Jon, super happy to hop on with you here today.
Happy to be here, Alex. Thanks for the introduction. We actually just had a conversation around how we should present the number of years I've been in this industry, because it's been about 15, but do we say 15? Do we say well over a decade? And I guess you went well over a decade, so thanks, Alex.
Yeah. You know, I feel like a decade sounds cooler than a specific number, so well over. We'll get you right there to 15.
It does, yeah. But of course, those 15 years have been spread around a bit, but I have been with Demand Drive for a good chunk of that, about 9 years. It's gone quick.
Yeah, I'll say. So before we get started and get to the real questions, Jon, I'd love a quick sort of synopsis rundown of what exactly DataFuel does. I know it was a smaller part of the Demand Drive group before. I'd love for just a quick rundown there from you.
Yeah, sure. So DataFuel was born out of Demand Drive, essentially, as the pretty much sole. This was about over 5 years ago when lead data, demand gen tools were somewhat at their infancy, somewhat coming into play. But Demand Drive had their own kind of lead generation process that we were feeding our SDRs, which are allocated and dedicated to other programs, SDR programs through our client base, where we're actually operate as the sole or augmented part of the SDR function. But in order to make those functions a success, we developed, like I say, this lead channel that ultimately became DataFuel. About 4 years ago, we kind of broke off and did our own thing, because we found that a lot of companies that wanted to work with Demand Drive, who were, let's say, 1,000+ employees, larger companies, who had their own SDR function, were more interested in that kind of top of funnel lead gen, third-party lead gen programs. They were already running them. They were looking for new channels, and we were one of them. So that was kind of the impetus. It was really client and organic driven. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, love to hear it. So diving in, I don't want to waste any more of anyone's time here. We've got 9 questions to run through that people have submitted. Questions across the board. What is DataFuel? What is content syndication? All sorts of those areas there. So without further ado, first question we had submitted: what do you see as the biggest issue regarding CRM data today?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Straight in there with that question. So I guess the biggest, everyone has this pain point of their own CRM data, and everyone thinks that they have the worst CRM on the planet. And, someone does out there. So there is someone that has the worst CRM data. But as a whole, I've never come across the perfect CRM database. You could throw a lot of resources at it. You can have a dedicated individual or team of individuals to constantly validate it. But ultimately, there's always going to be bad data in a CRM. And it's a question of how you manage that bad data, a question of how you manage the validation of that data, and it also how much importance you weigh, or how important you think having bad data is in your CRM. Does it really matter? And the answer to that is sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. As long as you manage it, as long as it doesn't interfere with the process of an SDR, for example, or the potency of a marketing campaign, i.e., are you getting a lot of bounce backs because of bad information, or are you able to filter it out using some tools that are native to Salesforce, for example, or are you just able to filter out based on simple email validation tools which of the data, which pieces of data you're going to put into a campaign are going to bounce or not? And there are plenty of tools that are actually free that help you do that as well. So in answer to the question, I would say that it's an easily manageable problem. But if you're looking for a very clean CRM database, which a lot of people are after, there's plenty of tools that can help you do that.
Yeah, makes sense. And it just seems like there's some work that has to go into it that might not fall under anyone's responsibility, but if someone's there to do it,
who's responsible for it? And that's that's often the issue with a lot of business processes.
Yeah, exactly. So find someone to own that, and hopefully it'll help clean up your database a little bit there. Moving on to the next question.
Exactly.
Yeah, moving on to the next question. You sort of pointed to this a little bit with your answer there. So this comes from somebody who works on the recipient side, I guess, of some of these vendor lists. So they asked, when we receive a list from a vendor, who should those accounts and contacts belong to on our sales and marketing teams, and how should they be followed up on?
Okay, so so two questions, really. So, yeah, who should they? I'll start with allocation of accounts and content and leads from third-party sources. I mean, it all really depends on what you're going to be doing with those leads, and also if you have a scoring mechanism. Some companies that I work with have a very rigorous MQL scoring mechanism where every lead from a third party, or every lead in general, even if it's from their own internal web forms, will go through a marketing nurture campaign and be scored until they reach a certain level, and then they get over to the next phase, whatever that next phase might be. It's often, okay, comes out of marketing, goes to SDR function, and then SDR to AE. That's the typical route. But depends on the qualification of that lead from the third party. If you're setting up a campaign to deliver you more kind of mid-funnel leads, then maybe you want to think about a prioritization qualification element. What I mean by that is, if you are running a campaign where one of the qualification criteria are time frame, what is the time frame of you looking to evaluate a new CRM tool, for example? If it's within 6 months, maybe you want to think about handing that over to an SDR, or within 3 months. If it's after that, maybe you want to think about routing it into a marketing nurture program. There's also double touch campaigns as well. We can get a lot done as a third party in terms of levels of engagement, and you're almost scoring that lead before it even gets scored by you, the client. So there's a few options there, and that's something that any decent demand gen agency or firm that you talk to will be able to guide you through. And I think it's very important for any company that you want to work with as a third-party lead source to understand what your lead flow is before they even engage. That's one of the questions you should start asking third-party vendors from the get-go to make sure they understand that. And then I think the second part of the question, remind me, sorry, Alex, what it was.
Yeah, mostly around how they should be following up with these leads once they come into the marketing or SDR camp. Okay,
so I somewhat answered that. If you're kind of prioritizing them based on time frame, there's certain nurture tracks that you want to put them in. If you're fortunate enough to have a pretty robust marketing engine, and you have nurture programs that are target specific, or industry specific, or competitor specific, so how your solution compares to a competitor that this individual is using. If you've got that kind of robust engine, then obviously that's the way to follow up. If you can segment, or have the third party segment leads to filter into those marketing nurture campaigns. And of course, if they go straight to SDRs, then the follow up needs to be, it's all around the messaging and the cadence that those SDRs will use. And I always like to recommend that, even though these are engaged with leads, they've engaged with a piece of content, they've given us some idea of their propensity to purchase, they've been through intent data sources, for example, they might still be a little unreceptive to a phone call, just like any person might be if they've gone through a web form, if you call them cold call, whatever it might be. So I always recommend that you don't call out the fact that they've downloaded a piece of content. I think that's now in a lot of SDR playbooks 101, that's not the approach in general. But of course, leverage the fact that they should be familiar with the brand, leverage the information that around that lead, the qualification around that lead, without calling out the fact that they've given away that information. Kind of use it to your advantage, rather than put someone on the spot and say things like, you downloaded a piece of content, you told us you were using this, is this true? That an interrogation is never the right way to sell. So I would always recommend still treating any lead from a third party source almost as an outbound lead, but obviously an outbound lead that has a much higher conversion rate and connection rate.
Yeah. So it's sort of, almost like it sits in between that outbound and inbound lead. It's like,
it does. Because
bits of both.
Listen, there's no way if any third party, DataFuel included, is ever going to get a lead as highly qualified as an organic lead that goes to your website, or that is interested in specifically your solution because they referred to by a colleague. That's rarely going to happen, and you certainly shouldn't count on that. Or you certainly shouldn't have that expectation from third-party lead sources. But they are very valuable to make sure that you have a full funnel of well-targeted, engaged with leads that you can action in various different ways.
Yeah, no, makes total sense. Awesome. The next question seems a little aggressive, if I'm going to be honest. The question they asked was just, what's the point in buying leads that all my competitors already have?
Oh, interesting. Okay. So this, I guess this comes from the idea that, a lot of content syndication leads are often opted in with kind of generic third-party content. In other words, these individuals aren't opting into your brand necessarily, unless that campaign is specified that way. They're actually opting into a piece of content or a publication, or they're subscribed to a publication that addresses certain topics that, as a B2B technology vendor, your solution might fall under the paradigm of that publication, or what they're talking about, or the topic they're talking about. For example, CISOs, a lot of them are subscribed to various IT security publications and magazines, online magazines now, of course, although I think they still do some hard copies, they send them through. But ultimately, those types of leads are applicable, obviously, for anyone that is in the IT security space. And the owners of those publications will sell those leads to whoever wants them at a price that is a CPL, cost per lead. But the issue is, and I think this is where the question is stemming from, is that every single client of that lead generation provider probably has been sold that lead. Therefore, if that lead is in the middle of an RFP, or if there's genuine interest from that individual around IT security, I'm using that as an example, IT security technology purchase, then the likelihood is that there's probably 4 or 5 vendors already on that lead, and that makes it less likely that you're going to be able to convert or to engage with that individual. Or ideally, you want to be the first in line. So yeah, I mean, that is an issue, and that's kind of an accepted element of this space. If you want to get there, make sure you follow up quickly, make sure you're first in line, make sure you're there with the right message as quick as you can, and sell value over your competitors, and hopefully you win the deal. But there is kind of some other lead channels that you can consider that would be more exclusive, that only have opted in to your brand specifically, and not just a third-party publication. Obviously, DataFuel does that too, or else I wouldn't be talking about it. But those are options. I'm sure lots of other demand gen firms offer that too. Hopefully, that answers that question.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking anecdotally, I've been added to, I think, like 5 or 6 newsletters that I didn't sign up for in the past 2 weeks. So it's definitely happening. And that's sort of one of the downsides to that, is you get prospects that are going to be more annoyed than if I'd only been added to one newsletter. The worst thing that happens is I don't notice it. But now that I'm like in a new one that I didn't sign up for every other day, I realize what's going on in the background. And it's not a good look for any of those companies that are sending me the newsletter now. Exactly.
And then also the unsubscribe process is, some companies treat it more seriously than others. In this country, and I'm talking about in the US, we're far cry away from European regulatory authorities crack down on kind of the sharing of private information and the unsubscribe laws and the opt-in laws. So, we should see that change over the years and as it gets more stringent. But ultimately, in America, the consumer, or in this case on the B2B side, the account and the contact within that account is responsible for unsubscribing. themselves, and if they don't, then they will continue to get and they'll continue to get newsletters, and they'll be continue to be sold as leads. That's how it happens.
Yep. Awesome. So speaking of change in the industry, and this is something we've seen a lot on the demand drive side of things with sales development, is that the buyer's journey has changed a lot over the last 5-10 years, right? Buyers are doing more self-educating, not entering the sales funnel until, a lot later. These changes and maybe some other things that you might have noticed about the buyer's journey changing, how have they affected the way content syndication and demand generation have worked on sort of the DataFuel side of things?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. If I'm honest, not much has changed, because I see it myself. There's still the same processes going on. There's still content being distributed in the same fashion, in the same channels. I think one of the major changes now is that we're starting to see the adoption of consumer type marketing in B2B marketing strategies. In other words, LinkedIn is becoming a lot more enrolled in these processes and targeted display ads and things like that. But then now we're seeing also companies use social networks like Instagram, Facebook, the meta universe of social outreach is now being adopted a lot more with B2B technology marketers, because ultimately, even B2B technology, the sale is still going to be with an individual who is also a consumer and buys as a consumer does, and has the same psychological thought process to purchase a solution, even though a B2B technology solution or a pair of trainers, you still have the same type of reaction in your mind, and you can be influenced very easily psychologically with the right placement of an ad at the right time, despite the difference in the type of purchase that still exists. I'm not saying, of course, that transactional sale of buying a pair of sneakers because you saw them on an Instagram ad versus buying $1 million piece of software is not vastly different in other ways. It certainly is, and there's no more than one decision maker when it comes to purchasing $1 million piece of software. But I think that when it comes to top of funnel advertising and branding, the same kind of psychological laws apply, and we're starting to see that more and more. Because of the buyer's journey, because of the self-education of ads being served up and them actually choosing which ads they want to view. If you can call that self-education, then that's fine. But ultimately, it's about getting to the prospect a lot further up the funnel. That's the major change I've seen.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next question is coming from someone that knows a little bit about what we do and sort of the way we personalize and customize the different campaigns for different clients. And they're curious to know, what programmatic differences do you make when working with a client who wants content syndication to just increase brand awareness and trust versus someone who's trying to get, actionable leads for their sales and marketing team to follow up on? Yeah,
good question. There's a couple changes, not just programmatic, but also the content itself that we would promote. And if it's if we're displaying it on an ad, or if we're emailing it over to a prospect, or if we're serving it on a syndicated publication, I think that the medium in which we're serving the piece of content is going to change. First off, and in other words, if it's going to be more of a branding exercise, we would use publications. If it's going to be more of a actionable lead, it's going to be more of an email approach, because it's more targeted and direct. We already know who we want to talk to. We're trying to get to these people. Branding is going to be more about an account-based approach, where we're just educating accounts that may not ever have heard of XYZ brand that they exist and this is what they do. Then, of course, the content itself, if it's going to be more of a branding exercise, it's better that a third-party piece of content like Gartner report or Forrester report, something like that, talking about the space, talking about your solution and how it fits in that space, an educational piece of content, much better for branding. Whereas if it's going to be actionable leads, it's going to have call to actions, it's going to have promotional offers like pricing, it's going to have a free demo call to actions, it's going to have freemium offerings, things like that. Think more promotional for actionable leads, more advertising for branding, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, makes total sense. And the assets that you're talking about, are those mostly up to the specific client on how they want to give it to you, and you just guide? Or
yeah, well, that's what DataFuel don't create any content. We usually use the content of our clients, of which there's usually ample in with the clients that we work with. But there are agencies that obviously can create content as well, and you can guide them as to, and they can guide you as to if you're looking for a branding exercise, looking for an actionable lead exercise, whatever it might be. This is the type of content you should create. You know, we don't do that, but we definitely guide through the process. So what's the purpose of this campaign? What's the the metrics of success, and we'll advise which type of content to use and which mediums to promote them.
Yeah, no, makes total sense. Sweet. So the next question, we got some statistics in here, unsourced, but I'll believe them from the question that came through. So they said, I recently saw a statistic that said 70% of US consumers, I assume that's private individuals, are more likely to buy from personally relevant product pages over generic ones. Do you see this reflected in B2B content syndication as well?
So I'm wondering what they're referring to in terms of generic versus personal.
So I think they're referring to something that says their name, probably targeted toward them. I'm picturing, like, I've seen a few Instagram ads. They're like, "Hey, Alex," that sort of thing.
Got it.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess this is a bit of an age-old question, and the SDR role is a prime example of when personalized emails versus generic emails. And we know for a fact that personalized emails outperform generic emails, generic marketing emails, by a significant factor. So I think the answer is clear in that wherever you can personalize, you personalize. Obviously, there's scalability issues with that, but there's a balance that can be struck. And there's plenty of tools in the marketplace, sales enablement technology, that can help with the personalization of scalable outreach. So, I mean, I'll keep it short for this one: personalized all the way.
All right, there it is. As much as you can.
As much as you can. Yeah. As
Fair.
much as you can. Yeah.
Fair enough. All right, so the next question talks a little bit about some of the definitions and terms that we've seen thrown around. They're curious to know what the difference is between second and third party data, and then what are some of the pros and cons of each.
Got it. Okay. Good question. And to be honest, it's confusing, and I was hazy about it for a while. Second party data essentially is the consumption of data that's sold from the source, from the first party, which actually we do at DataFuel, and a lot of demand generation companies do also sell second party data. That's more around a database that is owned by the vendor, that is also then selling that to the client. Third party sources are more around using kind of multiple aggregators from different sources to validate one piece of information, and then sold on, and then sourced from exchanges like Rubicon Exchange, for example, is a prime example. And that's kind of more of that's, you see what we were alluding to earlier, that kind of reselling of leads that haven't been specifically opted into one client. That's going to be that third party data. So the difference is, ultimately, from a third party data source, you're going to get the instances where a lot of people are going to be all over that lead. From a second party data source, there's going to be a much less competitive scenario, because they're only being sold to those who that client who purchases it. They're not being resold to any other leads, any other vendors. If they are going to be resold to any other vendors, they have to go through that same process of opting into that brand, or coming from the same database and opting into that brand. So that is the difference, and therein lies the key differentiator between the two in terms of what would be more preferential. Obviously, second party data would be more preferential. It's more limited. So if you need more volume, you go third party. The quality aspect should be pretty similar in terms of reachability, connectivity, accuracy. It's just going to be that ultimately the level of intent that you see, less in third party, more in second party, and the number of competitors that have already been exposed to that lead, more
Gotcha.
in third, less in second. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I was also a little hazy about that, so that is good to know.
Yeah, there you go.
Moving on to the next one. This person was talking about how they at their organization they're bringing on an agency to manage their demand generation providers.
Yep.
I know we've seen this a couple of times. What are some of the benefits of doing something like this, and why are we seeing it more often now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be very frank, it's all about vendor management and who has the time to, because a lot of companies now have, 5, 10, maybe even 20 different vendors they're using as a lead gen provider. That's a lot of vendor management. And if you can outsource the management of those vendors to a third party, to an agency that can manage all that for you, can run campaigns, can create content to feed into those lead channels, that's a big amount of work. It's a lot of bandwidth off the plate of vendors who want to work directly. They can still, oftentimes, and we do this too, we work through an agency but communicate directly with the client in terms of scoping out a campaign. That's often done. And another scenario that I've seen a lot is, especially with large companies, the onboarding process can be pretty arduous. So if you have an agency onboarded, then you don't have to go through that every time with every lead gen provider you want to test out. They can be onboarded by the agency, and the agency can vet the quality of the leads to make sure there's no issue. And of course, it means that you don't have to go through a 3 to 6 month onboarding process, which sometimes is the case. And trust me, we've done that, so we know. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, especially with larger organizations who it's a lot easier for them to pick an organization that specializes in it to help them out with that.
Totally. Yeah. That was a good question. I'm seeing a lot more and more nowadays. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. And then we have one last question, John,
Okay.
and we can wrap up.
Great.
This one dives a little bit more into our own products and offerings. So feel free to get a little bit self-promotional here. Don't feel bad about that. They're curious to know what some of the main differences are between account-based intelligence versus prospect intelligence. Aren't you primarily gathering account data either way, is the way they phrase it?
Yeah, this is clearly someone who's been to our website, and I appreciate that. So yeah, I mean, prospect intelligence is a phrase coined by DataFuel. So I'll explain what it is more generically, which is basically lead data around an individual. An account-based program would be account data about an organization. In other words, is that organization using a certain technology stack, and what is that? That's applicable to anyone who resides in that organization, who works for that organization. Are they going through any kind of digital transformation initiative, for example, that year? That's always useful to know, and that's an account level piece of information because there'll be multiple people involved in that, and it's something that the account is doing, the organization is doing as an infrastructural change. Maybe are they going through any infrastructural changes? That could be information that will be associated with an account-based lead intelligence report, for example. There are various other criterias on an account level. They're also applicable to each client that we might represent differently. The nuanced pieces of information about an organization that would help a client either not just prioritize, but also help with the messaging into that, with the traction with that account, with engaging with that account to make sure that you're positioning the solution in the right manner and at the right time to the right people. So there's an element of account-based that where you'll still need to know who to talk to, but who in the account to talk to, what divisions are responsible for what type of decisions, again, is an account-based piece of information and qualification. Prospect intelligence, i.e. lead gen on a contact level, will always be around the individual's propensity to purchase. And yes, with B2B technology, there's going to be more than one individual, but it's going to be information that's more around kind of immediate things like do they have a budget? Is the initiative aligned with this individual now? Does this individual own a budget to spend, or at least are they influential to that budget? Do they have an authority? Like I just said, are they an influencer or are they a decision maker in that process? It's going to be around that kind of BANT qualification. Ultimately, what's the time frame? You've been designated by your organization to solve this problem by maybe purchasing a solution that will solve it. What's the time frame they've been given to do that? That is a contact level piece of information. So that kind of at least gives you an idea of the key differences between those two things, and the focus on the account versus the focus on the prospect.
Awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And with that, Jon, that comes to the end of this AMA. For anyone that's watching at home, make sure to like, subscribe, do all the things that everyone tells you at the end of every video they see on YouTube. If you want to learn more about DataFuel, head over to datafuelmedia.com. Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn. Jon, is there anywhere specifically, if you want them to reach out to you, they can find you?
Yeah, no, by all means. I am approachable directly through any medium. Drop me an email, jon@datafuelmedia.com, and I'll answer any questions that have come out of this, or happy to jump on a call as well.
Awesome. And with that, Jon, thank you so much for answering all these questions for the people out there.
No worries.
And we will talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Pleasure. Take care.